A few days ago, Republican Senator Ted Cruz published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, and he tweeted this conclusion. To America's CEOs, I say, when the time comes that you need help with a tax break or regulatory change, I hope the Democrats take your call because we may not. Starting now, we won't take your money either. Of course, social media understood right away that this is a stunning admission that Ted Cruz takes corporate money in exchange for doing their bidding. But actually, we already knew that. The other reaction on social media was, Ted Cruz, turn away corporate money, don't make me laugh. There's something else I see going on here which I find sort of intriguing. I wonder, is there a breakup in the works? Are the right-wing extremists in corporate America on the verge of divorce? Is Ted Cruz singing, You'll Be Back? Now, by right-wing extremists, I mean these guys. We know them. They've been with us since the start of the nation. 150 years ago, they supported the Confederacy. 100 years ago, they supported Jim Crow laws. 50 years ago, they felt threatened and angry when women and minorities began moving into positions of power. Now, they embrace QAnon. I'm also including in right-wing extremists people like Phyllis Schlafly, who worked hard to kill the Equal Rights Amendment and who, by the way, endorsed Donald Trump for president. So I'm including people who think women belong in the home and we should go back to the days when women were barefoot and pregnant. Now, we could call these people reactionaries or regressives, but given these modern images, let's just call them right-wing extremists. So before I talk about the marriage between corporate America and right-wing extremists, I'm going to go back to the beginning, the origins of the Republican Party. Now, at the time of the Civil War, of course, the Democratic Party was the party of the South and the Confederacy, the Ku Klux Klan. The Republican Party represented business and industry. That's because the Northern economy was based on business and industry, while the Southern economy was based on the plantation system. So the Republican Party was also anti-slavery because at the time they went together. If you were anti-slavery, you were pro-business because business didn't go with slavery. The plantation system went with slavery. So at any rate, when we get to the 1920s, the Republican Party still represented business and factory owners, but the Republicans by this point dropped civil rights from their platform. The Republican Party, as a Democratic Party, was now coming to represent workers and laborers, which is kind of interesting because they had been pro-slavery and now they were pro-labor and workers. But what happened was once the Republicans dropped civil rights and was simply representing businesses and corporations, the Party of Labor was the party opposing the Party of Business. So, this chart, put together by a group of economists and published by the New Yorker, shows the extraordinary income inequality we had in the 20s. The rich were very rich and the poor were very poor, and it was hard to move up the ladder. There was basically no middle class. If you were born into a wealthy family, you could go to college because basically all it took was money. If you were born into a poor family, it was likely you wouldn't be able to finish high school because you had to work to survive. Now, in the 20s, there was no Social Security. There were no worker protections. If you were injured on the job, you were simply left to starve. There were also very few regulations on what businesses could do. They could basically do anything they want, including things that are illegal today. Companies could fix prices, they could manipulate markets, they could basically cheat in all kinds of ways. Now, in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat, came to office, and he enacted what's been called the New Deal, which is a very popular series of economic legislation. The New Deal gave us Social Security and protections for workers and the GI Bill, which offered a college education to returning soldiers and basically educated much of a generation. As a result, in the 1950s, America had its first strong middle class. But here's the hitch. Blacks were left out. Racial segregation was legal. Laws kept blacks from the polls. In some places, blacks who tried to vote were killed. Now, I'll come back to that in a moment. Blacks did benefit from the New Deal, but indirectly, and not to the extent that whites did. Because they did benefit, at the time of Roosevelt, they began migrating to the party of from the party of Lincoln, where they had been since the Civil War, to the Democratic Party. Now, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt era also ushered in lots of regulations for industry. And these things went together, rights for workers and regulation for industry. Now, you can see that as a result of the New Deal, by the 50s and 60s, there was much less income inequality. It was also much easier for people to move up the ladder if you were white. The problem Republicans had in the 40s and 50s was that the New Deal was very popular. Some Republicans wanted to roll back the New Deal. Some of them wanted to get rid of the regulations on industry. Now, the problem is that the economic agenda that these pro-corporate Republicans wanted was not popular with the voters because it favored the rich, and most people aren't rich. Actually, the desire to enact policies that help the rich is based on the idea that in a free market economy, the competent people rise to the top and they deserve more money. The idea is also that if competent people are given complete freedom, what they'll do is create jobs and the money will trickle down for everyone else. This brings me to what political scientist and Harvard professor Daniel Ziblatt calls the conservative dilemma. The conservative dilemma goes like this. Conservative economic policies are unpopular. So how can a party with unpopular economic policies win national elections? Now, I talked about 1954 as an important turning point. This is when the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board of Education declared segregation, racial segregation, illegal. This ignited the civil rights movement, which prompted then the modern women's movement. And then in the 60s, some Democrats, like the Kennedys, began embracing civil rights, which helped bring about this shift in the parties. So when the Democrats started embracing civil rights in the 60s, they knew they were going to lose elections for a while, but they did it anyway. So the Democratic Party at the time, though, was still the home of white Southerners and segregationists in the Ku Klux Klan, where they had been Democrats since the Civil War, but they were not feeling so comfortable anymore in the Democratic Party. Now, the civil rights movement and the anger it sparked gave Republican corporations and business interests an idea. They said, we can achieve electoral majorities if we invite these angry whites into our party. They invited them in with what have been called dog whistles. A dog whistle is a racist comment that looks innocuous to most people, but has a specific meaning for the intended audience. So, for example, on the 1980 campaign trail, Ronald Reagan gave a speech in Neshoba County where he said this: I believe in states' rights. I believe we have distorted the balance of our government today by giving powers that were never intended to be given in the Constitution to the federal establishment. He delivered this speech a few miles from the spot where 3 civil rights activists were shot and killed in 1964. Now, his remark could be taken as sort of an innocuous statement about constitutional law, but residents in Neshoba County who sympathized with the former Confederacy and other right-wing extremists understood that Reagan was signaling his agreement that the federal government overstepped its bounds when it ordered the South to desegregate. In this way, Reagan could win the votes of the white supremacists without offending the moderates. He could keep the moderates happy and bring these right-wing extremists into the party. Now, Reagan famously described the coalition he built as a 3-legged stool. The 3 legs were strong defense, limited government, and traditional values. Let's look a little closer at these 3 legs because they're kind of dog whistly. So strong defense meant anti-communism. The Soviet Union at the time was communist, and a lot of people, particularly business types, were afraid that communism was going to spread. Also, communism was sort of a buzzword that the conservatives used to denigrate things like Social Security. It's a piece of communism. Limited government meant get rid of the New Deal and the laws that regulated industry. After the Civil Rights Movement, it also meant get rid of the federal protections in place to protect minorities. Traditional values means what? It sounds good, but now we know from the way Republicans behave that it really never meant what it kind of sounds like. It doesn't mean you can't fool around with your wife while she's pregnant. It doesn't mean you can't run off with 17-year-old girls. Actually, it was a code phrase for women in the home. A traditional family was a place where non-heterosexuals have no place. It was anti-abortion. It also, therefore, drew in what's been called the religious white, the white evangelicals. The deal was this: we will appoint Supreme Court justices who will overturn Roe v. Wade and allow for discrimination of blacks and allow for local governments to roll back the laws that gave all people access to the polls. And in exchange, you let us give tax cuts to the rich and deregulate industry. This marriage or coalition between the pro-industry types and right-wing extremists worked because both of these groups had something in common. They both had this hierarchical view of people. The white supremacists and the Ku Klux Klan believe there's an ordering with whites at the top. The trickle-down economists believe that there's a hierarchy with the most competent at the top. The traditional family people believe there's a hierarchy with men in charge of the family. Actually, see my video on hierarchy and fairness for more on that. So Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, and he immediately started deregulating industry and offering tax breaks to the rich, this sort of thing. And look what happened. Income inequality started rising again, and now we're at 1920s levels, with a difference, of course. Now we have Social Security, and we don't have racial segregation, yada, yada, yada. Okay, so people in the upper income brackets, you can see from this chart that people in the upper income brackets have increased their worth. The middle class has declined quite a bit, and lower income families declined somewhat. So at this point, we have this happy marriage between right-wing extremists and corporate interests. But what happened next was that these extremists in the Republican Party started growing more extreme and more powerful. The corporate guys kept going along because they were getting the economic policies that they wanted. Now, Yale political scientist Jacob Hacker and Berkeley political scientist Paul Pearson in this book explain how the Republican Party at this point kept radicalizing. What the Republican Party leadership basically did was outsource voter mobilization to Fox News and groups like the NRA. The Republican leadership said, we'll enact the social and other agenda you want if you send us voters so that we can get enough votes to enact the economic policies we want that favor the rich. Remember the conservative dilemma. How do they get enough votes for an unpopular economic agenda? So this partnership with Fox and the NRA was a boon to GOP candidates because Fox could get them elected. But outsourcing voter mobilization has its drawbacks. Eventually, Fox and the NRA exerted more and more control over Republican officials. So we won't deliver the votes if you don't do exactly what we want. Also, they started getting more and more extreme candidates elected to office. So pretty soon the leadership of the GOP no longer looked like, were basically these guys dressed in suits with better haircuts. Then along came Trump, who threw out the dog whistles. Trump wasn't coy about it anymore. He came right out and embraced white supremacists, who he called very fine people. So Reagan's dog whistles have now given way to brandishing the Confederate flag. When Trump did things like strong-arm the president of Ukraine to open an investigation into the Bidens, or encourage an actual attack on Congress to overthrow an election, Republican leadership had a choice. They could say, whoops, we shouldn't have let these extremists into the Republican Party, we're going to throw them out. Some traditional conservatives, like Jennifer Rubin of the Washington Post, think that the Republican Party needs to throw out the white supremacists and the insurrectionists and start over and work on persuading voters to accept their policies. But there are a few reasons why the Republican Party turns out they can't. This would split the party. This would mean that they would lose elections. Remember, the conservative dilemma. There are not enough people who want to give tax cuts to the rich and instead tax the middle class. There aren't enough people who want those kinds of policies. There are not enough of these guys to win national elections. Even put together, they're a minority, but put together, they've got a lot more numbers, and they come close to a majority. They can win, for example, if they find a way to throw out ballots. Now, another reason the Republican leadership can't throw out the extremists is because so many of them are extremists. To take one example of what I mean, look at Marjorie Taylor Greene. Shortly after she was elected, she liked a comment on Twitter that advocated putting a bullet through Nancy Pelosi's head. She had previously questioned whether 9/11 was a hoax, and she flatly stated that Barack Obama was a secret Muslim. She also accused the Clintons of murdering John F. Kennedy Jr. I talked about this kind of extremism a little bit more in my last video on fascist lies, so check that out if you haven't seen it. A January YouGov poll showed that 30% of Republican voters have a positive view of QAnon. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's behavior was getting more outrageous. When he actually incited a violent insurrection against Congress to overturn an election, we're long past dog whistles here, the Republican Party leadership had a choice. defend Trump and the insurrection and alienate the moderates, or denounce the insurrection and lose the support of the radicalized QAnon base. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell tried to walk a narrow line, as Republicans had done in the past. He tried to nod to the insurrectionists by voting to acquit Trump, but he tried to keep the support of the moderates and corporate donors by stating immediately after the vote that Trump was morally and practically responsible for the insurrection. This attempt to play both sides didn't work. Corporations, which had always been not only supported Republicans, but they were the Republican Party, these corporate business interests withdrew their support. Instead of distancing themselves from these guys and trying to win back the support of the corporation, what McConnell did was pivot to soliciting donations from individuals. He went to the grassroots, radicalized part of the base. He fundraised by denouncing cancel culture, and he echoed these false claims of voter fraud. He fed into these QAnon conspiracy theories. Now, the right-wing extremist part of the base opened their wallets, and it worked. McConnell hauled in more money from these individual donors than he had in the past from his corporate donors. Now, I'll put links to sites and sources where I'm getting all of this into the notes. So as the Republican leadership turns to the right-wing extremists for donations, the spiral of radicalization continues because they have to keep pleasing these QAnon types. Now, in light of all this, consider Ted Cruz's tweet and how the Republican Party has come full circle. They started as the party of business representing the wealthy. They brought in these extremists and white supremacists so they could get enough votes to pass an economic agenda that favors corporations. Now, the extremists have taken over the party and are threatening to throw out the corporate interests. Well, what we're seeing raises the question, will the Republican Party, which started as the party of business and industry, jettison the industry and business portion of the party and become purely the party of white grievance and extremists? This would bring the Republican Party full circle. Obviously, the party that started as the anti-slavery, pro-business party would end up the party of white supremacists and insurrectionists. Oh, well, I'm thinking about doing one of these weekly, at least for a while. Will you join me next Sunday? Each week I'll pick a topic and maybe respond to your questions. So next Sunday, grab your favorite Sunday morning beverage and join me. Thank you.